right. Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us. This is Sides of Thoughts, Conversations with the Alliance of History Graduate Students. My name is Jacob Glicklick. I'm producer of the show. I should tell you that the things you will hear over the next hour represent the views of Sides of Thoughts and the people making them. All opinions and questions in no way represent River West Radio. They're the sole responsibility of the producer, guests, and callers. River West Radio is therefore not liable for any legal issues arising from the content of this program. So for tonight's episode, I'm going to follow through on some of the talk of politics and political alienation and disconnection from regular circumstances to the sort of one of the literary extremes that end up with science fiction author Philip K. Dick. And in that context, also discuss some of the 60s and 70s, in terms of political and cultural expression. So joining me tonight, returning guest Jason Kennedy.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
Oh, thanks for being here. And also joining me, returning guest on the phone, John Terry.
Hello, thanks for having me, Jacob.
Okay, thanks for... Oh. Okay.
Am I causing feedback?
I don't know. Probably could have been my end, but let's all try to avoid holding anything metal too close to the phone or receiver. All right, so... In any case, talking, Philip K. Dick, influential author, managed to become cult favorite, and then has, since his death, managed to have more, critical acceptance, academic studies, and to a degree still, widespread things. Jason, you know this better than I. I mean, Philip K. Dick's books sell fairly well.
Still fantastic. They don't stop moving. I believe every year more and more people discover him. And especially since the Exodus came out just like a year ago, publishers have been repackaging all his books. And people are buying them all anew, and it's great to talk to new lovers of Philip K. Dick.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, definitely. And I guess I should sort of partly confess that I've been, PKD fan for longer than I've been historian in terms of where the sort of interest and enthusiasm and things I've reread. But I guess I'm trying at this point now to approach his writings not just as a fan, but also as a historian in terms of what do they show, why do they become expressed in this way, why do they have degree of, why was it difficult for him to support himself financially from his work in his own lifetime, and then why does it possibly mean that he's taking on new life now? Yeah, I mean, within all that, I guess, for people who are not as familiar with the author, would just say, well, after this episode, go out and read them, generally. But I mean, the basic premise of most PKD books seems to be just the breakdown of reality, that either what the day-to-day circumstances are actually monstrous or alienating, or the reality might be pleasant, but it's also unstable and might collapse and something worse emerges.
Yeah, and I would say also the main character, if there is a main character, is usually not a heroic kind of character. It can almost be an everyman who goes through heroic situations or goes through situations outside his control, but he may not be the hero of the story.
I would agree with Jason. And one that seems to be the hero is always a he, but is always sort of. I think that it's someone on some level you can identify with, and it seems like you sort of root for the hero, even though they're usually not heroes in the stereotypical sense. Although, anytime a movie is made based on one of his novels, they become that. But I think that is an interesting point.
Yeah, and I mean, some cases it talks about some frustrations of daily life that are still, there's still dramatic things that happen. There's still apocalyptic situations that have to be coped with. But it's, it's still, Dick is with his eye on, in terms of the everyman trying to go through and survive kind of bizarre events that unfurl, or even the fact that, with attempting to stop, in terms of vast telepath conspiracies are in Ubik, at least initially in Ubik before things get strange. But they still focus on the difficulty of managing day-to-day life and having to pay off your refrigerator in order to let you use the food that you stored within it, and those kind of sort of like daily indignities of life, which are often magnified to a satirical level, like in the Simulacra, these sort of ads and commercials that come through are actual like physical insects that move around and have to be actually swatted down. But in all case, it's based on day-to-day issues and problems that are widely recognizable, and I think even 4 years later, not very dated.
Well, and you look at the fact that, like, when he was writing in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of unease. I mean, it's the Cold War era, and there's a lot of, I believe environmentalism was coming up at that time, and so a lot of his books have a lot of problems and issues and worlds. I can't remember the book off the top of my head, but I know there's one book, and it might be the Three Stigmata book, in which you can't even go outside without a suit on because the air is just so inhospitable to us. So he was touching on, I think, a lot of things that were on people's minds back then.
I think it was the Three Stigmata, where the average temperature was over 100 degrees, and hopeless life on Earth. But the government was drafting people to colonize other planets, but life was even more bleak and hopeless, such that they then were allowing manufacture of hallucinogenic drugs to distract people from the horror of their lives, and then afterwards they were then persecuting and fighting people for using the same drugs that were necessary to keep them in place. Which, again, in the sort of self-contradictory, paranoid vision of it, does again seem to touch something that's realistic to the time and to now.
And the line that goes throughout that is reality. I think even in that book, there's a lot of what's real, what's going, especially with the hallucinogenic drugs.
Yeah,
I'm just getting through. I just got through Valis myself, and I think that challenging what is actually real and what is not becomes really interesting in the more autobiographical works, and even maybe, and I'm sure we'll get into this, like a Scanner Darkly that really seems like it's set in like 1990s California or something like that, like not so much this fantasy world, and yet those same kind of issues are there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess it seems that the common themes that run through almost all of his books, and I guess the ones particularly of this period, I'd say his most productive. I mean, less so some of early 50s when it's still toying and has a few weird mind-bending ideas, but not as much about challenging assumptions and genre. But it maybe becomes questions of personal identity and instability of that, questions of drug use. Religious visions, religious transcendence of something beyond the human that's coming through, and I'd say also, capitalism and the commodification of people, material relations, and these often get very intertwined. In Three Stigmata, which mentioned, the very title becomes a religious illusion, and the whole plot is driven by the fact that, in terms of God is basically evil and is coming to corrupt or destroy people, and he's coming specifically through a marketed new drug. That's all the things mentioned before, like the bleakness and the need for hallucinogenics. It's just kind of the setup for the story.
Is God capitalism?
In part, or at least in the work, at least in that one. God uses capitalism, and that it's there's even a slogan within it. God promises eternal life. We can deliver it. It's the escape and the possibility of just going from your body, which it turns out it also traps you in the consciousness of this alien godlike being. By the way, this whole episode will have spoilers for 40-year-old books that are not hugely plot-based, so I guess be warned, other viewers. But
he does have that really clever notion of marketing, and throughout these books, because even in Ubik, the whole thing of what Ubik is, but it's cleverly marketed throughout while the group is having these mass hallucinations of what their reality is going through, and when it's crumbling around them, everything around them is pointing to something mysterious called Ubik. And I wish I could remember one off the top of my head, but I can't.
Yeah, it becomes a form of detergent for run through, and then run through, and then at the end it's also a directly religious. I am Ubik. I created everything. I created a universe.
It goes from capitalism to religion. Yeah, he has this connection going there.
Yeah, so I mean, definitely the intertwining them. I mean, I think
Yeah.
one of the most distinctive things is the idea of you take, in terms of hallucinogenic drugs that then begin to show you like the actual world. Like the short story "Faith of Our Fathers," where the hallucinogens that seem to be take are actually the anti-hallucinogens. It shows you what things actually look like, and which again goes to sort of disturbing, like sort of God is very present and active in life, and he's fairly unpleasant and even just predatory. The idea of a divine force coming to then consume and eat people, or eat people's.
Plays with that very explicitly in Valis as well. I mean, sort of obviously like questioning. It's at the sort of at the time of the postmodern turn, but he actually he doesn't directly engage with that, but brings up sort of all of those ideas. I think really interesting stuff about the creator has to be is this an irrational invasion? So then what is reality? Are we all experiencing the hallucination? And then what is reality? And is reality actually irrational or rational? Very interesting ideas.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and in Valis, in some ways, even more so because it questions even the identity of the author that's writing it. The fact that the Philip K. Dick himself is both a character and is not, and several times, and introduced himself as introduced himself as someone named Phil, and he points that references earlier books that he's actually written, and then he has his friend Horselover Fat that's going through these crazy experiences that he describes somewhat skeptically. So in some cases, it seems like a mainstream fiction novel by someone by a character himself who is a science fiction author, but that doesn't feature in the story for a while, and then it describes these weird things that Horselover Fat is happening, but then halfway through describes that Horselover Fat just is a German that plays in words that actually means Philip K. Dick, so he has been narrating his own framework, and also begins the notion that all the crazy visions might be actually all true. It makes it one of it's like the murkiest books, and in terms of, and that is just going and unsettling like any kind of like stability of the subject and the authorial subject that would otherwise expect.
Well, I think it also mirrors a little bit towards the end of the book, because I think Horselover Fat, if I remember, at the end of the book is still, he's kind of looking for lack of a better term, kind of a savior. And I think you can get that out of the exegesis of Philip K. Dick as he's writing in this. He's looking to try to understand his, like what his epiphany was, or what he saw. And I think you're right. Valis is probably his most autobiographical work. And I think you get to the end and I remember reading that a couple different times and being completely confused. But I think he was.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and in some ways, I mean, also the point you're making that at the end, like, still kind of just, sort of searching for meaning, or even if after, within Valis, there's like extensive treatment of like how absurd and outlandish and like even like self-destructive theories are being noted, but at the same time, it still comes around to, at least in part, to endorsing them or finding, aspect of sympathy for that kind of belief. I mean, I reminded in that context of Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, where, it finds out there's which was the basis for Blade Runner, but had a number of aspects that were just sort of not translated or run through, like one of the, which is the whole religion Mercurism, that is kind of like empathy as the basis for humanities. And there's a subplot in the book where it turns out people find extensive proof that the main people behind Mercurism, and it's artificial, it's a fake, it's being manufactured by United Nations to keep populace complacent and calm. But then throughout that, the Mercury appears to several of the characters and argues that yes, his religion is a fake, but still genuine nevertheless. That there's sort of the kind of the triple meaning of like apparent authenticity, and then behind that it's a lie manufactured by hallucinations, by drugs, by in terms of weird reality warping. But some of the works also point to, like, underneath that though, it still might be true, or at least that there's a core that's worth preserving or cherishing. That the people who accept it, tend to be somewhat more satisfied, even if they still often like end the novels in a terrible, very unhappy place. I mean, not otherwise optimistic ones, but it seems that some of the religious aspects of it seem weirdly to be the most, in terms of humanistic or positive at the end, even while religion is often described as just either a delusion or like as something that might be actively dangerous for people.
Yes. What can you think of any happy Philip K. Dick novels?
Not.
Scanner Darkly maybe verges on the closest at the end. It seems like there's almost a glimmer of hope that possibly the character has infiltrated this organization and may possibly be able to report back and tell somebody where this drug is processed. But that's about as close as I can think of any of them coming outside of the short stories.
Yeah, I mean, although it's somewhere that just every time we read that one, just become more depressed because of how, in terms of just crushing the complete destruction a person's personality is. Maybe even Man in the High Castle. I mean, even though it does have, well, instead of it, it's the alternate timeline where Nazis win World War II, and one of the subplots in this book is the death of Third Reich leadership that is going to lead to a power struggle, with the characters concluding that either that it's likely to be either one of the Nazi candidates that wins out that will then lead to a aggressive foreign policy and nuclear war that kills everyone, or possibly the more evil, the even more repressive, that the good guys, I mean the Japanese, who are rendered comparatively sympathetically, would have to back him and fatally compromise themselves just to try to hold the status quo and not all die in nuclear flames. So that aspect is extremely depressing. But but beyond that, so that is the setup. It runs through a lot of the characters seem to end with some level of self-realization, or either connecting more with people or desiring to connect. So I guess less isolated. Which is better than
that. Valis is maybe sort of one of the more, I wouldn't recommend starting with Valis really to anybody who wants to read PKD, but I think, maybe the idea that, of this sort of idea that time doesn't really exist, that there is no actual destruction, that you will live on forever, I guess, is sort of a glimmer of some kind of hope, although, same with Scanner Darkly, it's like if the guy's going to infiltrate and find out and report, well, first we're going to have to completely destroy his mind. It's like, well, you'll have to die before you can live on forever. But there's at least that sort of hopeful, maybe, kind of idea that, the destruction is not permanent, and that, maybe time doesn't exist in the way that we think it might.
Yeah, and I guess as we're talking about this, I was thinking, one of the earlier questions of like why if PKD's writings have like gotten so popular and have win so many readers each year, and are able to sort of sell well. I mean, why didn't they catch more on in his own lifetime? And maybe we're getting to just how, both depressing and how it's like alienating, that most of the books are about alienation, are about people that meet extraordinary challenges and don't always overcome them, that sometimes just end crushed or alone, or crushed and insane and alone. And so I guess tradition of it, compared even with other some sci-fi or like new wave authors, you think PKD becomes more harsh or pessimistic
in today's light, or
at the time, really? In terms of like other things that were happening in science fiction.
I think that other science fiction at this time, and we were talking about a couple of authors beforehand. I think PKD is actually right on with everything. I personally, since I didn't live then, I'm not sure why it didn't take so long. It took so long to get popular. But I guess if you look at some of the authors I think of are like Anthony Burgess and writing Clockwork Orange, or even A Wanting Seed, and those were both not happy endings to either book.
Well, Clockwork Orange had that ending chapter where he gets reading in his version, but
I don't
kind of
get that chapter.
Yeah,
I'm like Stanley Kubrick in that assessment.
Yeah.
But I guess he wasn't as popular either. But it definitely wasn't a mainstream science fiction at the time.
Yeah, and I guess it's interesting. I mean, some of the things talked about before. I mean, like the emergence of the ecological consciousness, the idea that maybe actually this planet might be doomed by all the things that we were doing and were previously so proud of, including, I mean, science fiction. In terms of up through certainly 50s and even much of sort of 60s of it, is very proud of the unlimited industrial growth and newer and better gadgets that if we don't get blasted by aliens, we'll be able to overcome sort of problems or at least have vast adventures. I mean, thinking probably like the Lensman run through from 30s or otherwise. I
have a question for both of you guys. Now, I know both of you are way more familiar with the genre. I mean, I'm about 12 PKD novels deep, but really outside of that, much less attuned to what was going on at the time. But I have this sort of notion, I mean, it's really that most of the science fiction elements play as some kind of setting, and then some, like Scanner Darkly is really sort of straightforward. I mean, it doesn't really, other than like the massive scale of the surveillance, but usually it seems like the most science fiction, I'm thinking of maybe like the Three Stigmata or something like that, that really the most science fiction-like elements, other than time travel or, notions of like messing with time are always there, but really have this kind of religious sort of feel to them, whereas I get like, reading like Robert Heinlein or something like that, where it's actually like a science fiction adventure story, even though they're, all the time being used to sort of make a commentary on what's happening at the time or what they think, the direction of, the United States or the planet is heading. But it really seems like PKD doesn't use the science fiction to establish much of an adventure. And even I think that doesn't carry over well, like Blade Runner and Total Recall, as movies sort of give people that idea. But really, I feel like it's just a kind of, he uses that setting to play with the characters a little bit more than to establish like an adventure or a hero or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a large extent, the goal of books isn't to show off the sci-fi or like the cool ideas as much. I mean, it becomes a notion of what people are like living through with it through this, which is not completely different from some of other, authors that become active in the 60s, or in some cases like Robert Silverberg, change their style to kind of this more psychologically focused run through. And I guess PKD is interesting because he for a long time just wanted to make it as a mainstream author and wasn't able to get many of his books published, and was in some cases just turning out the sci-fi things, writing them very quickly. And I think like Scanner Darkly in particular becomes interesting as a sort of ambiguously multi-genre work, because particularly from one token of view, it describes things that actually happened. I mean, it ends with the postscript of PKD mentioning the people that he knew that had been burned out through drug use. It's really only some of the aspects of surveillance and the notion of a drug that is literally making it possible to break into separate personalities that becomes and like the camouflage suit. So in some cases it becomes a little more paranoid and a little more focused, but it's largely done through people who are having their minds burned out through drug use. So I could feel like if there was no concept of a genre called science fiction, you just read Scanner Darkly without other context, you might think it's a more stylistic thing. You wouldn't think it's about building up the world or environment or about technology, since it really isn't.
Well, what's interesting is I think if Philip K. Dick was writing a lot of the books nowadays, like Scanner Darkly or even Valis, I don't think we would have those in the science fiction section. I think it's when it came up, because there's a lot of books being published nowadays that have these kind of very metaphysical elements to them, which is, I see a lot of playing with reality and perception and religion and consequences of action. And I really think that it was the fact that he was doing, I think, yeah, like you said, he wrote his books very quickly, paycheck, not always so quickly, and he wanted to be a mainstream writer, but he tapped into something in his own subconscious in writing these. As I remember reading that he didn't really believe his consciousness was working while he was writing. like it was completely subconscious, and it probably has something to do with the drugs. I know he took a lot of drugs and a lot of novels, and I think Scanner Darkly, he said, was the first novel, or that I read, was the first novel he wasn't like on amphetamines when he wrote,
Yeah, I think,
which is kind of interesting.
yeah, certainly. But even more so that, yeah, in context, we're talking like Valis and something like the ones where I think gets like really far out, even compared with earlier stuff, was not done, was done while sober and not to alter. I think it was in the end, the mysticism counts more. But also, I guess question I wanted to ask you, John, in thinking of the context of this and what comes about or what it might show or what we can use these texts for. I mean, I know that you're doing the counterculture class in the fall, and you're planning on having science fiction elements and assigning a sort of, I think, what was it, a PKD novel and several shorts.
I'm thinking about offering a range of choices, but I almost wanted to do, but it feels like it's counterintuitive to assign a Scanner Darkly to say, like, why is this science fiction? Because it's really, I think, a tough question. I mean, to me, I see there's some connection to sort of what's going on, and, Dick was involved with a lot of characters. He was in Southern California in the 60s, like very aware of Richard, Nixon, which obviously comes out in Valis, and he relates that to his own personal religious experience. And I think that, he was very fearful of, like, surveillance. He was always afraid that someone was going to break into his house, and, there's even the story that someone blew up his safe, and his friends actually thought that it was probably, he did it and had no idea that he did it because he was that paranoid. I think that there's the paranoia obviously amplified by the drugs, probably amplified by, most of the people he associated with were on drugs as bad as him or worse than him. And you get that sort of list of, the victims of the lifestyle that they were living. And obviously, that guilt of that has this unbearable pressure on him and that comes through in Valis. So, I mean, I think really connected to his lifestyle at that time, some of those elements really make sense. But then really a lot of his writing, especially again Valis, is like trying to sort of transcend the moment. So I think he's a really interesting character for trying to make, saying that it's like the savior has come in 1974, like at the moment that he has this epiphany, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. So he's reflective of his time, but also I think he's trying to make the point that there are these certain elements of that would maybe be just filed away as drug paranoia, or we're worried the FBI is after us or something that maybe we should take seriously. And a lot of science fiction authors, I think, play with that concept a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that aspects that representative of the time becomes, partly, just the sort of the paranoia, the fear of government surveillance. I mean, the fear of the corporate surveillance, or even just corporations as unchecked monstrosity. I mean, we talked with Three Stigmata, it's someone that's moving in to use, marketing and commodification to express more and more control and just replicate itself endlessly. Ubik has similar process. It's the ultimate villain of this that's shown as breaking down reality. Just is hungry. I saw actually there was a review done Adam Roberts in analyzing PKD's novels at one point, a British science fiction author that also reviews things sometimes, talked about that for Dick, very rarely shows characters, sitting down and having a meal. Actually, just eating is like almost never. It's only like Man in the High Castle, which in some ways becomes a little more warmer and a little more settled and a little more straightforward than a lot of his other works. In other cases, the idea that people are just consuming or eating things is tricky, since it is sort of suspicious about claims to own things, like even claims to own your own thoughts or own your own perceptions of reality. So I guess also, it strikes me just how appropriate and representative of certain aspect of not just 60s and 70s, but 60s and 70s California. I mean, the notion that PKD had lived in different areas, both Orange County as well as in terms of Bay Shore, where you can move in terms of within a short drive from closed, segmented, very in terms of very reactionary sort of worldview to sort of the ultimate hippie hangout. So in that sense, some of the even juxtaposition becomes some of the realist and science fiction elements. Like you have a lot of plots and scenes and things of it that seem to be taking place in 1960s California, and then they'll sort of reveal that there's also intergalactic war going on, and people are in terms of worrying with this, and there are also space colonies and all these technology and telepaths and anti-telepaths and precogs and anti-precogs. But just some of the sheer weirdness or juxtaposition that actually was part of 60 at the time, that there actually were contrasts that, at least on a social level, on an organizational level, cultural level, were like almost as extreme as what you find.
I think what's interesting to me is what you were just getting on when you were talking about all those words that you telepaths and anti-telepaths and precogs and all that. And just think about that idea for a moment. I think before Philip K. Dick, if we're talking about writings of the 70s, I don't think anybody had that kind of conceptualization. And it goes from novel to novel. It's not like he uses it in Ubik and then it disappears. You see it again and again in his works, that he has these elements kind of strewn across all his books. Maybe they don't go in every book, but what I find interesting is that what I think a lot of people love about him is that they feel comfortable reading his books because they build on each other. And more than just the Valis trilogy. The Valis trilogy obviously does build one on top of the other, but like his work as a whole.
Yeah, even at the same time, he didn't do recurring settings. I think there are like two short stories that take place, that reference the same events and take place. But otherwise, each work is a, own verse, as it were. But it's very truly shown by kind of common vision and a similar sensibility and type of character or different character interactions that surface.
There's a lot of writers nowadays that owe him a lot because of that idea, of that familiarity when you open up a book. Because I think there's a lot of people who've come after Philip K. Dick who you read the book and you're like, okay, you can pick out the influences that Philip K. Dick had on that writing.
I think it's interesting too that he is such a near future writer. So he's writing in the 1960s, and it's like it's 1990, and we have colony worlds, anti-telepaths, and telepaths, and all these things. That it just seems like it's very much of the moment. Like his future settings are in this very very near future. I feel, which is sort of interesting. I mean, he could just say this is the year 22 or something, or 2200 or something like that, and yet he goes for 1990, which is I think great because Scanner Darkly, I think actually the movie does a good job of showing this. Like it's sort of when the time meets, when we finally get up to that time, it really it feels like he sort of pegged it, and that could maybe just be the movie influencing me. But
and you would think that it would be the opposite. You would think that because these are a lot of near future 1990s, that you kind of almost pigeonhole yourself into, if you're not right, your books kind of die out, and it's the complete opposite. And the other writer, I think, that did that still people read is the 2001 Space Odyssey. I mean, he set that pretty near. And I almost feel like a lot of writers from that era must have really just had been building up this. We've been building up this momentum. It had to be like a World War II push, where the entire economy of Western Europe and the U.S. were just building up at such a rapid rate. Of course, we'd be living on the moon or doing having all these things by the year 2000. I mean, it just makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it seems that probably a sort of convention, which I'm not even sure when. I think it seems at least partially died out. That most science fiction authors that are publishing now are much more reluctant to give definite dates, and if they are, it's going to be centuries in the past, since they don't want to to a sense of 20 years later being proven wrong, or so to speak. But yes, I mean it seems appropriate for this, partly since as I think a build up with World War II and 60s and 70s. I mean the notion of the pace of life happening so much that it doesn't seem far fetched, or that to imagine it within his within own lifespan that you would see these extreme and weird things. And I think the reason that it hasn't hurt later on is because since it's not done for the focus of seeing how he describes weapons or technology or even the reality-altering drugs, but how he describes the characters doing to that. And I think, and like the idea of works getting more of life and reality becoming more absurd and surreal is something I think that just has happened. I mean,
I agree with that.
The example I always like to use is that Google News now, and I think as of like the last 7 months, has now distinguishes for their news article but they tag it as real or satire. That Google News now, the people who underwriting program it has assumed that just knowing the news story and seeing the article won't be able to tell whether it's The Onion or reality, so that you have to do it so that of course the sort of readers can know how to approach it, and that we're not otherwise able to distinguish it because data life has become so exaggerated and surreal.
I also think, an interesting just sort of parallels, right? This is shortly after it kind of landed on the moon, and if NASA has like sort of a heyday, it would be around the time, right? Satellites are in construction, people are landing on the moon, and then also, I don't know if you could call it a peak, but this is when LSD, people are sort of like, this is altered state time, right? People are like looking for all of these sort of ways to transcend reality. And you also have, like this actual, like, well, hey, somebody just landed on the moon, 5 years ago. So, like, this very, I could see this this idea that things are going to happen. I still, it seems to me that is, if you look at, like, a movie like Back to the Future, right, like, which is set in, like, 2015, or Demolition Man. I'm trying to just think of, like, these films where it's like, well, of course, in, like, 2015, we're going to have flying cars. And I still think now, the perception of like, well, of course, in like 2040, we're going to have flying cars or something like that. That might.
We think it's always attainable.
Maybe. Yeah. So I think partly perhaps modern culture be slightly either less optimistic or less envisioned towards the future. I think in some, I don't know.
We're still oil based. So, and I think we were talking about getting off of that in the 70s.
Yeah, and partly because of ecological consciousness. I think I would argue partly because of increasingly obvious like political dysfunction, political failure that has made people, I think, less likely to seriously speculate in terms of like that 30, 40 years down the line there might be such and such. People I think might be more likely to either just not imagine it or imagine an apocalyptic situation, which is certainly I think what a lot of mainstream writers that do science fiction do. I mean, if there's a future, it's where people are largely dead or dying. Or
I think 80% of like the apocalypse. I mean, it's all apocalyptic fiction now. It feels like.
Which is perhaps I think that's somewhat suggestive of current culture of it. But I guess also with Piketty in like retrospect, if you're reviewing some of like the themes that one through, I guess should also as a point of criticism talk. I think at least briefly about the gender focus, or like how Piketty writes women, which I think is generally a fairly terrible and blatantly sexist manner. I think
not as bad as Robert Heinlein.
Well, true, but yeah, it's difficult to get. Well, it's not actually is. I shouldn't know, but among sort of like big name Heinlein just went because of the phase where it's just like I will be dirty old man to write in terms of sex fantasies is run through, and by so doing will be taboo rendering and will have all characters just incest because that's fun apparently. But so anyway, it's, but I mean with Piketty it seems that it's partly maybe the biggest problem of autobiographical approach, that since if he draws on experiences of their own life and including you can track fairly closely how some characters thinking of Ubik in terms of Kathy's and as sort of just these sort of arrogant mocking in terms of temptress, even though it has like vast reality altering power, is still shown as defined by sexuality to a much larger extent.
Yes.
And how that tracks with like the dissolution of several marriages that it does seem was either venting or just perceiving a run through that. I guess most of his characters are often like neurotic or pathetic in one way or another, but it seems that generally has a lot more sympathy for male characters. Even in some cases male villains who do atrocious things than does for the sort of women that are in novels too.
I would agree with you. I think it has to do something with the status of his marriages. That I don't think he had a successful marriage, and does that have something to do with it? I think it does, especially in his later books, where you would sometimes think that maybe the writing would even out a little bit, is in turn to writing women, but it doesn't really.
Not mostly, although the very last ones, the Transmigration of Timothy Archer was actually a female protagonist for like the only
That's
book,
the only time. Yeah.
which I think does a more sympathetic job, and maybe I guess A Scanner Darkly to an extent because it does. I mean, partly because of the twist and showing the one major female character not as dysfunctional as seemed. So it's not altogether sympathetic, but it's, I guess, a little more psychologically complex than usually tends to be, which I just find.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a woman's role is to bother the protagonist in some way, shape, or form in most of the novels. But then it's really apparent that the most important events in his life are really based on his real life experiences with women, and he's also a guy who's like when he's in his 40s, dating 18-year-old girls and stuff like that, and having high school girls over to his apartment for drug parties and stuff like that. So, I really think it's interesting how important I think women were in shaping his philosophical outlook. And then on some level, all of that weight on him, it kind of disappears in the novel. So most, and almost every woman is taught, women apparently are not going to wear clothes in his future, right? Like they all have painted, breasts and wearing clothes and things like this. Like a very common, runs through a lot of his work. So it's really fantastic. All of his ideas about clothing are really fantastic to me. I don't think anybody really thinks of that, but that definitely seems like something that carries through that. A woman is usually there as like this artifact or relic of the main character's past, or this thing that bothers him, or even when they're pursuing them, it's really not this sort of like loving relationship kind of thing that you would imagine.
No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I've always found that just interesting as a dimension because the things that most generally love about PKD's writing also in terms of an autobiographical element. I mean, become bound up with a more problematic one since even while he's able to use personal experiences because to say I think pretty pressing interesting things with class representation of class because it has the sense of the outsider, the little guy, the person that's being exploited in one way or another. It doesn't bring necessarily the same level of empathy in terms of two women. I guess also, we're curious, asking particularly John, the thoughts with like representation of race across the novel, since it seems. He tends to like show overt racists are shown as almost as more cartoonishly evil than most of characters, and often just are like die horribly soon after. But of course, it's virtually all Caucasian protagonists if it run through, and it does seem that there are times like Flow My Tears policeman said sort of there's this kind of subplot about in terms of how the police state is dealing with African Americans and run through, which I wasn't sure what run through. I guess from curious from my own perspective what thought might be doing.
What is the one? The title's escaping me. There is a black protagonist in the sort of post World War III moment?
Dr. Blood Money.
Yeah, Dr. Blood Money, I guess. So you have sort of that example. I think that is an interesting novel, but really not. It's not something that. He plays with really very much. It's there's other ways that you can use science fiction, and I guess I don't know to the extent that I'm convinced that, Star Trek is all just about like the current or contemporary problems with race at the time. I feel like it's, I would imagine that, Philip K. Dick imagined himself as living in this white world. I would imagine most of the people he associated with were white, and I don't know if it's something that, because he was obviously an intelligent man who was living in Southern California, like a sort of hotbed, but he's very close to like the Black Panthers and things like that. All these things are going on around him, so it would not be that he would be unaware, but I guess there's something that just seems to be in his work that not seems to be important to him, and then to what end? I I wouldn't know how to assess that.
Yeah.
Like, that would be interesting to see what, I would like to hear what even just like a black fiction writer would have to say about that, to see what, at what level are you expected to incorporate that. And, if it's just sort of like television shows in the 1980s or something like that, where it's like, yes, we all know that people of other races exist, but they just absolutely do not factor into this. I'm thinking of like Married with Children, there's one token black character or something like that. These worlds that are completely white and seem to, you lose something there. I especially think with science fiction where that would be an angle that, you could use to cause for all sorts of different, narrative purposes
Yeah.
in the story. Yeah, I don't know. Really
Potentially, though. Yeah, it seems that I guess when practiced, it becomes like different kinds of allegories, and particularly like in framing about imperialism and colonization and some of that aspect of racism as it exists in context. And I guess the fact that American science fiction tends to be even in some cases more white than mainstream American literature run through of it. So, I mean,
You have to hunt and look further up.
yeah, I guess that's why Samuel Delany is one of the only prominent Black American science fiction authors run through it. Does
Octavia Butler.
but more recently. And Delany. Yeah, so I guess I'm curious. I haven't like if there was any contact or interaction like with Delany or and PKD.
There was nothing in this that I think, but
Okay.
there was no contact there. But
It's just, in this context that Philip K. Dick's interactions with Joanna Russ, sort of the author that was interested in using science fiction for like radical feminism and projection of that with female man was pretty contentious, and she wrote one to punch him in the face at one point after some comments. Of course, I guess
the opportunity was there for, I think a lot of the stuff that Dick was, Colony World, all sorts of different things that he is sort of using. If he wanted that to be an element, he certainly had plenty of opportunities that would have fit close there. The one time that he has a black protagonist, it really doesn't seem to. I don't think the novel would change very much if the character wasn't. So that's sort of interesting. I think it was right too.
I wonder if he thought that it was far enough in the future that race didn't matter.
Yeah,
But I don't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pushing it. I know that's pushing it, but or maybe it was just a subject he was uncomfortable addressing, and
Yeah, actually, For My Tears connects somewhat. Since I think that has like a few passing references to government limiting the size of black families as part of larger population control.
that's right.
I think
bumps into a black character at like the gas station, right, or something like that, and have like a moment there.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one because it Fill My Tears in a number of ways because it was one of the ones that most clearly reflects contemporary concerns. It doesn't do that much with world building. Even with, as we've talked about it, in the world building and setting isn't the main point for most of it. But he still is. He usually has like gadgets and oddities and things that make it more colorful and different from contemporary situations. Whereas For My Tears, it's pretty much police state's in charge. There's celebrities. There's a few more pieces of technology, and the military is now surrounding universities and slowly starving out the students. So it becomes a very specific extrapolation from.
And there's a police state
the
going
time.
on there where you can't get anywhere without having IDs.
Yeah.
And if you don't have an ID, well, that's not a good thing for you.
Yeah, and it's so clearly. Like 74. In the context of Nixon and the militarization society and outgrowth of executive authority, and issues with. Even just in terms of Kent State and 68. Just specifically about police. In terms of violence and police authority and extending that. I don't know. It's interesting though. Also because For My Tears was one of only two books to get something like award recognition or recognition within the science fiction community at the time. Man in the High Castle that won the Hugo went through, and then For My Tears, which I guess Jason, you theorized before that it was nominated for Hugo and Nebula and a few things and was.
Well, I think it was that he was just coming off his longest break as a professional writer. I can't remember how many years. It was a few years, and in that time, time, it was already starting to go from that cult status to that next level where people were actually starting to pay attention to his body of work and trying to extrapolate his thoughts and his theories and his philosophy of writing out of his works. And so I think, that was the right time because for him and so forth. Through the next 8 years, I think people started to get him and understand him and go out and read his books. Scanner Darkly did well, maybe not award-winning, but everything started working very well after that for him. And then, he died just when things really started to click.
Yep. I guess even in life it wasn't. That different. It's Exegesis where he talks several times about how many people come up to him and said that the world is resembling your books more and more. That I start to feel like I'm living in a PKD novel. And he said yeah, I've been feeling that as well. It's kind of alarming, really. That. I guess For My Tears also is one of the other works that have become a little less. I think it becomes a little bit more awkward or potentially run through. It's something to make it stylistically different. It's the only PKD book that has an epilogue that has a point where it's building up with sort of police state, etc., and then afterwards we're just seeing that it just kind of collapses and the characters go on and live in some cases semi-happily, other cases not so much.
I guess you could throw that into his cheerier endings, but the cheery ending stories that he has.
Yeah, it's
like, some of the short stories, which I think that for every author should be taken differently and analyzed differently than novels. But some of the short stories sort of tend to have a somewhat happy ending, or just make such a sort of a point that maybe would be darkly humorous or something.
Well, yeah, I find his short stories fascinating because to me they're so different than his novels.
Yeah.
His stylistically even, they just he has an idea and maybe it's not there's not a beginning, middle, or end, but I think he does this perfectly. Where some of his really short, I love his stories that are under 10 pages. And I'm terrible at names. I'm not going to remember any of the names right off the top of my head right now, but it's more of conceptual. He gets a concept across to you. He gets an idea. It's not really about the plot. There is no plot. It's the idea. It's great. I recommend his short fiction to everybody.
Yeah. And to me, that seems, I was going to say that I think lends itself so well to the film adaptation. So, it's not surprising to me that, nearly all of the film adaptations of his work, thinking from a director's or a screenwriter's perspective, saying, what a fantastic idea here. And, he doesn't, I've said it some time, I want 20 more pages of this because the idea is so cool. And I know that you would be able to do this better than so many other people. But, he's just here's this great idea. Imagine if you're the replicant and you have no idea, or imagine, if you wake up from this year off, and you find out what you've been doing, right? Where you've been working and you've left yourself these clues. I think, or Minority Report, I think a lot of those really lend themselves well to that, and I would anticipate, any more film adaptations. I would love to see Ubik. Me and Jacob we still have a chance to film that. But I would watch that.
Yeah.
Imagine with more short stories, Although I would be happy to see, the novels. I would love to see how somebody would even try to, how would you handle the Three Stigmata or Ubik? I would love to see that as a motion picture. That would be very interesting.
Well, and I think
you're right. They're very different.
Yeah, and I think, the great thing about Philip K. Dick's work, which has intrigued directors for the last 30 years, is the fact that the framework is all there, and you can kind of veer off into different directions if you want to. Both the Total Recalls are they both have the same idea behind them, but they go off in completely different directions.
Yep.
But the core idea is the same.
Yeah.
Yep.
And similarly, as much as I think most the movie adaptation of the book, I found either disappointing or different enough in one way or another to be disappointing. And it still becomes worth. You'll generally see of it because it allows a way to a sense of the scenarios or old stories or even just the old names that are breaking into what is culture now, that what is can be seen and viewed now. So I guess we're close to time. I'm wondering if you had other concluding thoughts or summaries or other.
How about what's your favorite PKD novel and why in like 2 words?
Ubik, just paranoid Gnostic intensity. 3 words, but I've come around with that a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be boring because I'm also going to say Ubik, but really for me it was the very first Philip K. Dick book I read, and it just blew me away.
And I guess, this is very interesting. I was going Ubik all the way myself, but I was for just this strange, dark humor that pervades it, and I really think Runson and Joe Chip are some of the best characters in all PKD, although I would recommend all of his novels very highly. Ubik seems to stand out to me as well.
And among other things, you can always buy Ubik at Boswell Books, which guest Jason Kennedy works. As well, actually, a number of places, whoever's closer, the People's Book, even though they have a fairly modest science fiction section, they do have PKD and they do have Ubik. So
They should.
yes, essentials, the classics. All right. Anyway, yes. Well, thanks for tuning in and joining us. This has been Sides of Thoughts. If you hope that can tune in again next week. We're in a slight non sequitur and shift of topics. We'll be discussing co-ops and sort of non-corporate economic foundations in the River West context, and specifically with the River West Co-op. And encourage you to stay tuned if you want to listen to Killer Radio Show coming on in just a few minutes, and also to tune in again next Monday at 10 p.m. when John will be back from North Dakota and resuming a normal show, Say It Loud, Random Slides of Music History. Oh, and final brief note for the Milwaukee listeners, which I believe are the majority of them. There's a fundraiser for River West Radio that's coming up in a few weeks, so clear calendars to come in and bring friends to come in and support local community radio. That's September 28th at 8 p.m. at Linneman's. That's on Wheel and Locust. 8 p.m. September 28th. There'll be a couple other announcements as we hopefully build into things that can help, River West Radio Inc. Pay for some of the things to keep us going. Anyway, thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for having me on, Jacob. Across the great state of Wisconsin here. I've been on a radio show now, so
Awesome.
Thank you. And I'll call you if I get back on time
Sounds
to go
good.
for a drink.
Sounds good.
Safe
Okay.
travels.
Yep.